Hello again, you're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. I'm Liam. Today's topic is a big one, but I'm going to try and do it as concisely as possible given the size of the topic. I want to discuss the state of U.S.-Iran relations. And I'm going to do that by breaking it into three parts, as I often do. First, I will outline a historical sketch, the way that relations unfolded between Iran and the United States over the course of the 20th century. Then I will discuss the Iranian nuclear program and the deal signed under Obama that would have tried to contain it. And three, I will discuss some possible rationales for the state of relations and why they have developed the way they have, what might be behind some of this. That, of course, is going to be a much more complicated part and much more like subjective, but I will give a couple of possibilities and leave it open from there. Okay, realistically, to discuss relations between Iran and the United States, you really have to first look at the relation between Iran and the United Kingdom, since the U.S. is in many ways a direct heir to British policies throughout the Gulf region. And I won't discuss the longer span of that. We won't talk at all about the 19th century relations. I won't talk about the British role in helping to engineer the rise to power of Reza Shah. None of that's really relevant here, but there's one really key element that is, and that is the oil concession signed in 1901 between the Qajar Shah and a British investor, which turned over rights to all of the petroleum in Iran, and this is the rights for exploration, for drilling, for refining, for export, the whole kit and caboodle, in exchange for 16% of the company's profit. That's not its total take, that's 16% of its profit after all expenses. And that cash would go not to the Iranian state or the people, but directly to the Shah, which was intended to be used the way a lot of his other concessions were to fund his own lifestyle. Iran under the Qajar was an extremely weak state without a lot of institutions that were responsible to the people overall. That was bad enough, but it was just a piece of paper for a while. Oil had been discovered in Iraq, but no one knew for sure where it was in Iran or whether it would be, but it seemed reasonable. In 1908, large deposits were uncovered. And from that point on, this concession would become a significant source of contention between the Iranian state and the UK. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, which is an ancestor to British Petroleum, or BP, was tasked with all of the oil work in the country, and it did. It pulled the oil out, took it down, built a giant refinery, and then exported it to the world, and as promised, turned over 16% of the profit. Now, this is after a revolution had replaced the Qajar and put in Reza Shah, and then after a kind of all kinds of later reforms, that it stayed the same. Things did not change. Multiple attempts to revise the deal to get a better deal for Iran vis-a-vis the AIOC and Britain were constantly rebuffed. There was no getting around this. Britain had a deal. They got the piece of paper. The oil was theirs. This presents a significant problem moving forward. But it's not yet an American problem. The Americans were actually still the good guys, and stayed that way for a while, all the way through FDR's term in office. With, of course, the minor exception that they did back a joint British and Soviet occupation of portions of Iran during World War II to help facilitate the shipment of goods, moving things like, Ford trucks from America to the Soviet Union to aid in the war effort. But that wasn't, of course, directly an American action. It was hard to blame the Americans for that. And during the war, during the 1940s, two different economic missions were sent by the United States to Iran in an attempt to help them to reform their economy, to modernize the economy. And this seemed like a decent idea. The United States did not have the reputation as the imperial power in the area. They'd not been doing anything like that anywhere in the Middle East. So they seemed like a neutral arbiter. It as it happened, the reform discussions here all broke down. The American advisors in different departments ran into resistance from local officials who felt that it was a scam intended to keep Iran weak, that focusing on things like agricultural reform would not help them to catch up to the West. Ignoring the fact that they probably needed to reform some of those areas before they could get into anything more complicated, but you can see where some of the resentment might have come from there. Anyway, the mission sort of broke down and ended, and that might have been that. But after FDR died in office, he was replaced by Harry Truman, who was a dyed-in-the-wool anti-communist and opposed to any kind of socialist policies or anything that remotely looked like socialism. Well, that wasn't a problem in Iran at the time because the socialist parties were all kind of like either illegal or suppressed in other ways. The Tudeh had no significance whatsoever politically. Iran was not a socialist state. What it was a semi-constitutional monarchy. When, during the war, Reza Shah was deposed by Britain for overtly favoring Nazi Germany, his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, took power, but initially took a more hands-off approach, and he allowed an elected government, an elected parliament, the Majlis, to form and to actually represent the interests of the people. Iran had a functioning prime minister and different departments and an elected government, and the Shah took a backseat on most policy. And that stayed that way for a while. It stayed that way into the early 1950s and might have continued to stay that way if not for a fateful decision in 1951. When the last round of attempted renegotiations with Britain over that oil concession broke down, the government in Iran took the fateful decision to nationalize the oil industry and to seize the AIOC's assets in Iran. Now, they opened negotiations, as people often do in nationalizations, and attempted to compensate the company for its losses, but Britain refused and held its ground on there, demanding the return of all of its assets and control over the oil industry. At this point, Iran is sort of like stuck. It tries to keep things going, but it quickly faces an international embargo driven by Britain, which convinces other countries to stop buying Iranian oil, since it no longer gets the profits from it. So exports are drying up, but they're trying to keep people working so they don't end up with the massive economic problems that would be caused by a significant round of layoffs and the piling up of the reserves without a market for them. So Iran starts looking for help. And it initially turns to the United States, which had been a fair broker with them before. It asks for help. Can you please help us in negotiating with Britain? This doesn't seem like it should be that big a deal. It was our oil, and we were getting a bad deal, and we tried to do this the nice way. Britain didn't want to. Can you please help us negotiate? And Truman's approach was no. And they asked for it, well, can we please take some loans maybe to help keep the economy going, and then we'll sort this stuff out with Britain, and then we'll pay you back. And again, Truman shut them down. And that was that up through the election and, the basic changing of the guard there when Dwight Eisenhower took power after the 1952 election. And the dynamic there, already bad enough, was about to take a significantly sharp turn for the worse. Negotiations between Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and Dwight Eisenhower went just as badly as negotiations with Truman had been, and Mossadegh was routinely vilified in the American press for the nationalizations, sort of held up as pinko commie scum, I guess you could say, for having been involved in this, despite the fact that he actually wasn't. He was from himself a liberal party. He had not been in power during the nationalization, but he became prime minister afterwards, so he inherited the mess. But he was vilified for the nationalization, and the Cold War context is significant here. Unable to do anything about it directly, the British government, since it had its own diplomats expelled from the country for being spies, it turned to the United States. And Eisenhower turned the problem over to the CIA. And that gives us Operation Ajax. which was a move in 1953 whereby the United States government overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh government and replaced it with an absolute monarchy under Mohammad Reza Shah. The Shah had been informed of the intent. He was asked if he was willing to go along with this and if he would be happy to be the American stooge and sort of run the country for them. And he agreed to this. It's a long story. The CIA used agents provocateurs in crowds to try to provoke things to gradually unravel the situation, and eventually steered things into an outright coup under the Shah, which it then promptly supported. And that's a significant part of the reason for the tensions from the Iranian side towards the United States. Why do Iranians have a problem with U.S. foreign policy? Well, in 1953 we overthrew their government. But it's not just that. And people do increasingly acknowledge that we did, illegally overthrow their government in 1953, but they tend to gloss over the fact that we spent the next 25 years propping up the brutal regime of Mohammad Reza Shah. And the CIA was involved directly in the training of the Savak, the secret police used by Mohammad Reza Shah to clamp down on dissent, teaching them in lovely practices like torture, and not of the waterboarding variety, I mean real torture. And it was used. Not only that, the state was propped up with tons of U.S. military aid. The Iranians were the first to get their hands on all kinds of nice export kit. They were one of the first places to get the F-14 Tomcat exported to them as a fighter jet. They had very close relations and close ties to Washington because Mohammad Reza Shah had learned his lesson. Do not cross the Americans. Do not cross the West. It had cost his father his throne, and it had cost an elected government. Right? So he knew better than to push his luck and, played ball. And that 25 years of dictatorship is a big part of what Iran holds over the United States still today. But again, it's not just those 25 years. There is more to the story there. When revolutionary discontent began really breaking out in earnest in 1978 in Iran against the Shah's government, the U.S. did, of course, everything in its power to try and squelch this, to support the Shah. Carter's government had initially criticized some of the Shah's repressive policies during the course of the Iranian Revolution, but when he met with the Shah then personally, and somehow, mysteriously, oil production started to go up, which lowered prices, and then Carter backed off on the human rights discussions and gave the Shah a free pass. Well, there are a number of significant massacres that take place in later stages of the Iranian Revolution, including like the Muharram massacres, and, hundreds and hundreds of people were shot dead in the streets by security forces, aided and abetted by the United States. When the Shah's government was finally overthrown by this broad coalition of minor shopkeepers and students, radical ethnic separatists and socialists, conservative clerics and dissident liberals. I mean, it's a broad spectrum of people involved in the revolution. When this revolution manages to topple the Shah and start the long process of figuring out what kind of government they want to build for themselves again, instead of doing the thing that's in keeping with American principles of self-determination and self-government, the United States did something that it frequently did during the Cold War period. It backed the dictatorship, and it refused to accept the overthrowing of its friendly dictator in Iran. It refused to acknowledge what was going on there, and it cut off relations with Iran. And that has stayed the case all the way to the present. We lost our friendly dictator, and so Iran became a pariah. Never mind the fact that they overthrew a dictator who was torturing people and murdering people in order to create their own elected government. And I want to stress here that the Iranian Revolution was not some giant conservative, theocratic, religious affair here. It was actually, again, a big tent, a broad coalition of people, and the initial president and prime minister were both secularists. We did not know from the start that Khomeini and his faction would gain total control of it. And in fact, it took them until 1983. It took nearly 5 years for the Khomeinis to consolidate control of the revolution and take over and rework the direction of it from there. But even there, even with the religious constitution that's in place that guarantees the clerics a veto on laws that they deem un-Islamic, even with the supreme leader's influence and control over the military and portions of the economy, even with the theocratic elements of the state, Iran is still considerably more democratic than most of the Middle East. Not quite as much as Turkey in some ways, but close. Right, they're in some ways, they have different problems, but in some ways equivalent. Slightly less democratic than Israel, but less so than you might think, because there are a handful of theocratic elements in the Israeli governing system. But definitely less democratic than Israel, but much, much more democratic than any of our Arab allies, with the sole exception of Tunisia, which overthrew its dictator only a few years ago. Despite that democratic credential, despite a constitution that protects the rights of religious minorities and guarantees them representation in government here, yes, Iran does have a flawed human rights record, but it's no worse than our friendly Arab allies. So claiming that Iran needs to be punished and cut off because of the Khomeini government and, well, today Khamenei, but the religious government in place there, and because of its human rights record, we need to punish Iran, that's absurd, because we've cozied up to far, far worse regimes repeatedly, both during the Cold War and all the way up to now, including, for example, the Saudi regime, which is an absolute monarchy, not representative in any way, shape, or form, does still execute people for crimes. It has the same basic rate of capital punishment that you'd see in Iran. Does also have a similarly bad human rights record and actually limits freedoms considerably more. Right? Minority rights, non-existent in Saudi Arabia. Women's rights, almost non-existent. Right? Iran is far more progressive by comparison. So the human rights argument is not remotely convincing here. The key issue is power and oil. The loss of our friendly dictator who was aligned with us during the Cold War, right, and helped us to, provide a bulwark against Soviet interference in the Middle East, lost. Friendly access to the oil supplies, lost, because they're definitely going to favor other countries and other companies after Americans had screwed them out for so much under Mohammad Reza Shah. So that's the key issue for why things get kind of pushed apart in the first place, and it keeps getting worse. That's the part that drives me crazy about this sort of conflict. It seems bad enough as it is, but the United States kept playing the part of the bad guy in the story here with Iran. It helped to support the Iraqi invasion in 1980 that led to the brutal 8-year war, the Iran-Iraq War. During that war, Iraq repeatedly used chemical weapons against both soldiers and civilians in Iran. Many of the chemical components that went into those weapons were sold by American companies with U.S. government connivance, and there was no great outcry from the U.S. government about the use of chemical weapons. We only objected much, much later when there was political reasons to attack Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is a little Hitler. Look, he used chemical weapons against his own people. We used the turn against the Kurds later as propaganda, but we generally made no mention at all of the use of chemical weapons against Iranians. That was somehow totally okay in our book. So the use of weapons of mass destruction against the civilian population, not a big deal, right? Which again puts us as sort of the bad guy here. And, there's a notable event in 1988 where the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 and killed 290 people, the entire complement of the jet, because we shot it down with a surface-to-air missile. And it was just a big oops, we thought you were a military plane that had veered into the wrong course or something, but exhaustive investigation showed the plane was exactly where it was supposed to be. It was communicating on civilian channels, not military channels, and we did this anyway. It's like we committed murder and got away with it. And you wonder why Iranians might occasionally chant "Death to America." Well, it's not because they hate our freedoms. It's not because they hate Americans personally. It's because they hate our foreign policy and what the United States has done to their country. So that's a point of my little historical sketch, was to basically trace those relations. I want to move from here and start talking about the nuclear program and its complexity. All right, to understand the nuclear program in Iran, you have to know something about the economic priorities of Mohammad Reza Shah. And I won't go into any detail on this, but he was a fan of high-tech projects and sort of like big flashy demonstrations that Iran was on the map again, baby. Iran was going to be a player again and was going to slowly build up its economy to compete with the rest of the world. Iran was, for example, the site of one of the first fully automated factories in the world. A robot factory, the Japanese really took off with in the 1980s. This is, in the later 1970s, you've got an automated factory here in Iran. This is something they really could not afford to do, but really wanted to. The nuclear program is an example like that. It was a chance to show off the technical expertise and the education of Iranians, right? To show off their engineering skills. And the first nuclear reactor that they started putting in, the one that they started building down in Bushehr, was originally being built with foreign help, including American help. And this was being done under the Shah. It remained incomplete and just sitting there for decades afterwards until the Russians were contracted to come down and finish the job, put it back together and help to put it online. So the seeds of the Iranian program go back to the 1970s under the second Pahlavi Shah, but were only completed much more recently. Now, the pursuit of atomic power and the pursuit of atomic weapons are two different things. There are a lot of countries in the world that do make use of civilian nuclear power, but do not have nuclear weapons or the capacity to build nuclear weapons. It is possible, and has always been possible, that Iran intends to be one of these. I have a little skepticism there, so I will present both sides of the story to be fair, but we should start with the reasons to doubt that they might be intending to do this. Well, first off, there's a religious prohibition. The current supreme leader and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has said that it would be a violation of Islamic law to use nuclear weapons. That these are an abomination and that they should cease to exist in the world as a whole, that they're an evil weapon. So it'd be pretty damn hypocritical to then develop an atomic weapons capability. It would definitely undermine any remaining credibility that regime might have, even with a lot of its own conservative base. The second reason here is that despite having plentiful oil reserves and gas reserves in Iran, it does provide a different type of energy, and one that is much cleaner, that allows them to continue to develop their own kind of like internal energy capacity without burning the same sort of fossil fuels that they're exporting, which in the context of climate change and all those other discussions makes a certain amount of sense, because even developing nations are going eventually to start being pushed to move away from dirtier fuels and toward more clean sources of power in order to meet global targets. So that makes a certain amount of sense too. It also, again, is a point of pride. It allows them to show off their technical expertise. There's no conceivable economic reason for Iran to have a space program, but you know that it does. They do have a space program. They have successfully launched, I believe, mice into orbit. So that also is a sign of like national pride, a sign here that Iran, this ancient civilization, is kind of like, it's making it and we're powerful again and relevant in the world. Finally, it's worth noting that Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, unlike, say, Israel or North Korea, right, or India and Pakistan, right, other states that had developed nuclear weapons sort of on the sly later on their own. None of them are NPT members. Iran is, and would face significant sanction. And there were inspections in place before under the International Atomic Energy Agency, seeing that, while Iran did have secret knowledge here that they'd sort of stockpiled about how these things work in the first place, that they could not show that there was any significant development of weapons themselves, right? But the capability was there. So let's be fair and look into that, right? There is a strategic rationale for Iran to pursue nuclear weapons. And to be fair, we should give that a hearing as well, which is one of the reasons that I'm a little bit skeptical. Nuclear weapons are a fantastic deterrent against foreign aggression. And if you're going to have problems with a foreign power, and Iran has had problems with a foreign power, notably the United States in its recent history, then nuclear weapons are a useful tool there to prevent the possibility of war, to prevent an invasion. Think about how they've worked in two cases. Had Iraq managed to develop nuclear weapons during the heyday of its weapons of mass destruction research during the 1980s, had it not lost its only reactor at Osirak in 82, had Iraq managed to develop an atomic weapons capability, do you really think the United States would have invaded in 2003? It would have been far too risky, right? Even if they were terrible shots with them, they could have gotten off some scuds that destroyed entire aircraft carriers. They could have nuked Israel. Who knows, right? It's too big a risk. That's why there's really no realistic chance of war with North Korea. War with North Korea would already have been fantastically risky just in conventional terms because they have so much artillery and conventional rockets trained on the city of Seoul, the South Korean capital. But once you add an atomic weapon to that, the fact that they could nuke Seoul or nuke Tokyo, right, both of which are very easily within their range and wouldn't push their technology very much because they're so close. So it massively increases the risk-benefit sort of calculus there, whether or not this makes any sense to do. Can you afford it? Can you suffer the losses? All right? In a conventional war without nukes, an invasion of North Korea and a war with North Korea would likely lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths in Seoul alone from the artillery and rocket barrage, not to mention the potential for millions of casualties, which is what the Korean War in the first place cost. So that the nuclear weapons do serve a useful function as a deterrent for aggression. And if you put that into dialogue with the historical sketch about Iran's troubled relationship with the Western world and the United States in particular, then it really does make a certain amount of sense that they might want one, and it would be difficult to begrudge them that. The chances of them actually using one are negligible, which is true of basically any nuclear power because it's freaking suicidal. It makes no sense at all. You'd have to assume that they were completely irrational and wanted their own country to be wiped off the map. It's absurd. But speaking of wiped off the map, this is how it shows up a lot of times in propaganda. People make arguments, the former Iranian president Ahmadinejad had said that Israel should be wiped off the map, and Iran supports Hezbollah and has sometimes supported Hamas, and therefore it hates Israel and would want to nuke Israel if it had a weapon. You can see this a lot of times with Benjamin Netanyahu's hysterical rhetoric about Iran. Iran must be prevented from having an atomic weapon. The rationale to prevent Iran from having a weapon has literally nothing to do with the chance that they'll nuke Israel, because there is no chance that they will nuke Israel. Israel has, at minimum, 200 warheads, and it also has submarine-launched nuclear missiles, which means there is no way that Iran could target Israel's retaliatory capability. If Iran were to strike at Israel with a nuclear weapon, it would be completely obliterated in response. And it knows that. It absolutely knows that. The chances of it actually using them in war, zero. Right? The reason that people want to prevent them from having it is it would destabilize the region. It would allow Iran to throw its weight around more and intervene more in political disputes amongst players, and it would actually encourage the Saudis and the Egyptians to go nuclear, because neither of them would want Iran to be the most powerful player in the Middle East. right? And a nuclear arms race between the Arabs and the Iranians with little Israel in the middle, that makes people nervous. That's the real reason there. It has nothing to do with the threat of actual war between Iran and Israel, and it's worth noting that Iran has participated not at all in any of the conflicts with Israel to date. Short of supporting resistance movements like Hamas, which do engage in terrorism and do fight Israelis here, short of providing some financial support to groups like that, they've not done anything directly to the state and never been involved in a war before, so there is technically no state of war. When an Iranian leader says Israel should be wiped off the map, they're not making a threat. They're making a statement of policy that's held in common by a lot of Muslim countries in the world. Since the issue with the Palestinians is not resolved, many Muslim countries have no relations with Israel. Not just Arab countries. Only 2 Arab countries have direct relations with Israel. All the rest of them pretend it doesn't exist. Obviously it does, and they know that, but they refuse to acknowledge it. Iran is the same way. It does not acknowledge the existence of Israel and will not acknowledge it until the deal with the Palestinians is sorted out, until they work that issue out, until there's some kind of conclusion to that conflict. For political reasons, Iran has to maintain the policy that Israel is an illegitimate state and does not belong on a map in the first place. That's all it means. So when people hyperbolically cite these things in the press or in little videos and dishonest YouTube presentations, and I'm aware of the hypocrisy since I'm on YouTube now, but they're the reason I'm on here in the first place. When people make these kind of comments saying Iran can't have a nuke because they'll wipe out Israel, it'll be another Holocaust here, they are lying to you. It makes no sense at all. And longtime Iran watchers will generally tell you exactly that. All right, I want to make some comments now about the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That's the full name of that nuclear deal. It's often called the Iran deal or the Iran nuclear deal in the press. That's a deal worked out by the Brits, the French, the Germans, the United States, us, everyone sort of piling in, trying to steer the Iranians to an agreement that would have it break down its nuclear program and make the world feel a bit better. All right. And this despite the fact that it, again, did not directly have the capability yet for an atomic weapon, but probably would have been able to do it within 10 years had it continued the way it was, if it had that desire. So, the JCPOA works out a deal whereby it is impossible for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And here's how, right? In the deal, Iran turned over 100% of its medium-enriched uranium. All of it. Right? Turned that over, got rid of it. It also turned over 98% of its low-enriched uranium. And low-enriched uranium and medium-enriched uranium are both useless for atomic weapons. They cannot be used for atomic weapons. Their use is in nuclear reactor fuel. Right? They would have to be continually enriched much, much farther, which is a complex and difficult and costly process. The deal also required them to limit the enrichment of uranium to no higher than 3.67%, if I remember right. So they, that's for 15 years, they were locked in, could not enrich uranium any higher than 3.67%. Now, to get to bomb-making material, you need high-enriched uranium, not low-enriched, not medium-enriched. And again, they have no medium, and they can only keep low-enriched and only up to 3.67%. High-enriched uranium starts around 20%. That's the very bottom end of a high-enriched uranium. And technically that can be used in a bomb, but very ineffectively and an extremely low-yield weapon. Generally, any kind of bomb-making material from high-enriched uranium, as opposed to, say, plutonium or something, is going to be enriched to 90%. So, 3.67%, 90%. That's a big difference. That's a huge hurdle right there. And they have an inspection regime that would prevent them from reaching that goal at any time before that 15 years. They couldn't even start the process of enriching the uranium to get there. For one thing, they had to cut their centrifuge capacity by 2/3, so there's far fewer centrifuges even in operation. And they have a full inspection regime from the IAEA that is able to inspect all nuclear sites in the country and get regular reports on what's going on there. It can demand to see any site, and it has said over and over again that Iran is in full compliance with the deal, that it has not broken it at all. It is not enriching uranium beyond that 3.67%. It is not stockpiling large amounts of it. It's not going beyond it. It's not pursuing what it would need to do to get to the 90% and build a bomb. The United States government as well also accepted that Iran is in compliance. All right? The Secretary of Defense, they're in compliance. Secretary of State, they're in compliance. Who thinks that they're not in compliance? A number of radical Republicans in Congress and President Trump. And Trump's rationale for this is interesting. He has consistently criticized the deal. He tore into it repeatedly on the campaign trail. This is the worst deal ever. We got taken advantage of. Obama is a weak president for signing this deal here, despite the fact that this is easily the best deal we could have gotten, and it did effectively prevent Iran from building an atomic weapon. It pushed it down the field, right? It pushed it down the field by about 15 years, and at that point, hopefully relations would have been better, and we wouldn't have had to go that route. That's the goal that people like Obama had in mind. It gives you the possibility for a reset in relations. Trump has flushed that down the toilet deliberately. And he is a godsend to the conservative opposition against the reformist president currently in power in Iran, by making these kind of comments, by constantly threatening, by attacking them, by saying that they're liars, they can't be trusted, that they're breaking the deal, this is a terrible deal, the U.S. got screwed, Iran is screwing us, they're better negotiators and they screwed us, they took advantage of this makes no sense at all, and it just shows how little the U.S. can be trusted, that we would sign a deal and just a couple of years later tear it up, and it counts for nothing at all. Who can take us seriously as a negotiator if you're going to take that sort of approach? That deeply damages long-term relations, and not just with Iran. It affects our standing all around the world. And it wasn't a bad deal. The argument that this is a bad deal is simply absurd. It makes no sense at all. And you can tell by the way he discusses it that Trump did not read this deal and does not understand it. That he gets his talking points from Fox News and other insane people in government here, and not from his own advisors, not from the people in the State Department, not from the people who understand the document, because they support it. So why might he have opposed it in the first place? Well, I think one plausible reason is Obama did it. And you can see the way that he attacked Obama constantly, both throughout his presidency. I remember Trump was one of the leaders of the birther movement that tried to argue that Obama wasn't really an American, which makes no sense at all. You can also see it in the way that he attacked the fact that Obama turned over Iran's cash to it. This is often attached in a lot of dishonest rhetoric about the Iran deal, as in Obama basically gave them money. Right, they got a deal here, and they got free cash for it. We just handed them, here's $150 billion, whatever. And that's not true at all. That was their money. That was, again, one of the problems that goes all the way back to the 1970s, and one of the places where we were the baddies. We were the bad guys. We seized Iranian assets that were in American banks and locked that money up and refused to give it back. We also provided shelter to Mohammad Reza Shah when he fled with his family, and they robbed that country on the way out. They took everything that wasn't bolted down. So the Shah fled with tons of cash. The U.S. gave him sanctuary, and they got no justice for that. All right? And then we locked up and held their money, and we held it from 1979 until when Obama was finally forced by the courts to give it back. It was an international court that signed this. It finally came to a resolution in a court, and it would have been a violation of international law for Obama to refuse to hand over this money. But realistically, every president since Reagan should have given it back, because it wasn't ours in the first place. Right? And Iran had done nothing to deserve it being locked up at all. But that's often tied to it, especially in Trump's rhetoric. And I think the fact that Obama was seemingly responsible for both, that they both happened under his watch, I think that's his beef. Right? And the reason that he attacks this deal, not the actual details of the deal. Okay, for the third and last part of this video, And apologies again for its length. I think this is the most I could compress such a complex topic. I want to talk about the potential reasons for this. Why might the U.S. be pursuing the kind of policy that it does toward Iran, both in the past and all the way up to the present here? And it's consistently confused me personally, because Iran is, despite its semi-theocratic government, a considerably more secular society than the vast majority of the Arab world. The population is far less conservative, far more pro-Western and oriented toward the world. It's far more technologically advanced. It's better educated. Iran has a number of really good schools. Women actually outnumber men in college, getting good degrees and getting jobs. So that they have a significant workforce participation in Iran, which actually has mixed populations in the workforce and whatnot. It's not quite like the situation in, say, Saudi, which has an abysmally low female workforce participation and extremely weak educational system overall. It actually is in many ways a relatively progressive country and forward-looking country, and we have a lot more in common with Iran culturally in the U.S. than, say, we do with the population of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. No offense to the population there, but just in terms of actually American popular culture versus Iranian popular culture and Saudi popular culture, the Saudis are much farther away from us than the Iranians are. Iran also has a very diversified economy. It's, to use Wallerstein's understanding of the basic world system breakdown of rankings for countries here, Iran is not a core country by any means, but it's not a peripheral economy either. It's semi-peripheral. It still relies heavily on commodity exports, but it also has a relatively diversified economy, an educated workforce, a responsible government, effective government ministries. It's one of the strongest of the semi-peripheral economies. If not for the crippling impact of sanctions and whatnot and the continuing use of oil at all, it would have a realistic shot of becoming a core country again someday. And the fact that it's doing it while breaking entirely outside of the whole Washington consensus and doing it its own way and pursuing its own development course while cut off from the United States, I think that terrifies a lot of people in the U.S. It presents, a possible good example to other countries that maybe they can pursue development in their own way without the United States and without having to do what the U.S. wants you to do. I think that's the key issue there, the fact that they still overthrew our friendly dictator and have pursued their own neutral approach to development, dealing with everybody equally and not trying to play favorites in the Cold War. I think continuing resentment over that independent course is a significant underlying factor in the continuing antagonism between Washington and Tehran. We also have the fact that the U.S. is an heir to UK policy in the Gulf region. The UK used to keep military bases there and had propped up a number of the smaller Arab states as protectorate states, took care of their military and foreign policy. And the U.S. moved into that power vacuum as the UK began pulling out of these territories. It started to retreat from this sort of role in the 60s and 70s. And the U.S. still maintains bases in Qatar and Bahrain. It has bases in Kuwait. It has very close relations with all the Arab Gulf states. And all of them are deeply antagonistic towards Iran. The reasons for that are quite deep. Some of them are more recent political. Some of them go back to the conflict between the Safavids and their neighbors when the Safavid Empire was expanding in the early modern period. Some of them even go back to the cultural dynamics of the sunni-shia split. There are a lot of reasons for antagonism on both sides of the Gulf there. But the U.S. is sort of caught in the middle of it because when we took over those bases and we moved into those Arab Gulf territories, and then we moved into Saudi Arabia as well in the wake of the Gulf crisis with Iraq back in 1990, we inherited their foreign policy and their outlook, which means that Iran has to say the bad guy. We already had a reason to make them the bad guy because of our pet dictator and everything else there, but the fact that we want to stay on good terms with our Arab allies and keep those bases does mean we are to some extent held captive to the foreign policy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Bahrain and the Emirates and Kuwait, all of whom look at Iran as a tremendous threat to their existence for some reason. Right? So that also kind of like overhangs the whole thing. Now, the very last thing I want to tack onto here is a little discussion of the possible risks, especially since Trump is continuing to escalate rhetoric with Iran, which is the reason I'm recording this in the first place. We had an additional reason for Trump himself personally to be opposed to Iran and this Iran deal in his opinion of Obama. All right, but if you connect that to all the other reasons that we have here for this sort of like long-term antagonism, the developmental issues and the long-term institutional biases because of because of the revolution, and because of our being heir to UK policy and the Arab Gulf states. I mean, you've got all these reasons here to sort of put us on a collision course. We've got that now. What are the risks? What are the risks of continuing to pursue an antagonistic policy? And not just from Trump himself, but just in general. What are the risks of America continuing to run down this road with Iran? Well, for starters, let's look at some of the immediate issues here. This is an underreported fact in the U.S. press, but Iran has been cooperating extensively with the United States in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? And it continues to do so. Regardless of how bad relations have gotten in other areas, they have continued to work with us to help secure these different territories and avoided escalating additional conflicts in those areas. And I think that is something that we shouldn't willingly throw away, because Iran could be a real spoiler if it wanted to, given that both of these countries directly border Iran. They have a lot easier time interfering than we do. It's a lot easier for them to get involved and to affect things, and they could really throw us for a loop if they wanted to. So having them at least a neutral player and or in our court in those two conflicts has been a tremendous benefit to the U.S. since we were foolish enough to get involved in conflicts there in 2002 in the first place in the wake of the September 11th attacks. So there's that danger of pissing off the Iranians and having them complicate the situations in those two countries, and also with the fight with Islamic State that continued in Iraq and the continuing instability there. Well, how about Syria? Iran is in Syria, right? And it's also supporting the Houthi rebellion in Yemen. So there are two civil war scenarios in the Arab world right now that Iran is a player in. And again, they could make things considerably harder for us and make the situation even more unstable than it already is. Right? The fact that we could be drawn more deeply into these conflicts, if Iran were to act much more overtly and in ways that would cross red lines for the U.S., we might be drawn into a deeper conflict in both places. And the U.S. has been fighting in both places. Actually, Trump increased our military involvement in both Syria and in Yemen. This is, again, underreported in the United States because the U.S. media doesn't like holding Washington to account on its foreign policy, but Trump has dramatically increased our military participation in both territories, and the risk of conflict with Iran in those areas is there. So it could be a flashpoint, it could be a spark to a wider regional war, and that's the last thing we need. And lastly, there's the possibility of direct war in general. And you can see this in the sort of like bellicose threats that Trump likes to make. And he hopes that these sort of things like will bring people to the negotiating table. He sort of credits his little rocket man kind of like threats towards Kim Jong-un as having brought the North Koreans to the table. He thinks that he won there. He does not understand that North Korea completely owned him in those negotiations. But he thinks that his belligerence will get his way. And foreign policy does not work the way his business listens to him. Right? That kind of belligerence is not effective here. And there is the possibility of a miscalculation. Right? Brinksmanship always brings you that risk. Right? When two sides both yell at each other, there is the possibility of it actually turning to a hot war. Kennedy and Khrushchev almost did this, right? This can happen. So think about recently, Trump has been threatening Iran and attacking them and making all these comments about the Iran deal and whatnot. So President Rouhani says, well, if the U.S. attacks us, if they invade us, we will make this one hell of a big war. Now, that seems like a threat, and it was taken as a threat for war by Trump. Whether honestly or disingenuously, I don't know, but that's how he seemed to take it. It clearly wasn't. And it really is a statement of fact. If we were to invade, a country like Iran with its, 80 million people and advanced economy and advanced missile systems here? I mean, again, Iran has a space program. They have fairly effective ballistic missiles. It would be a much more costly war. If we tried to attack Iran, they could easily use missiles and sink whole aircraft carriers. Right? And we would have difficulty stopping that kind of attack. So it would be a very costly conflict for us, and easily the most costly conflict in terms of lives and equipment since Vietnam, if it actually turned to full-scale war. And Rouhani is simply pointing out the obvious. Dude, you don't want war. If it does come to war, we'll make it hurt. So don't push us, let's get back to talking. And it's worth noting that even though the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran, Iran remains in compliance with the nuclear deal. It has not broken its side of the bargain. Which, of course, makes the Europeans very happy. They're trying to, salvage the situation. If they can keep the Iranians happy for a few years, and if Trump manages to get replaced by a slightly more sane president, then perhaps the deal can be salvaged. Who knows, right? I think that's what they're hoping for. But Iran has actually stayed in compliance with the deal, which is remarkable. And so it presents the possibility here of getting back to the table. But Rouhani is going to make it clear that you really shouldn't push this, that this would be a big problem if you do. And Trump immediately takes that as like, dude, don't threaten me, and big all caps tweet, threatening to annihilate Iran. That kind of escalation and that kind of poor impulse control does present the possibility of a miscalculation that could lead to outright war. So while it's probably not very likely, there is the chance of actual war with Iran, and I think we should all be justifiably worried about that and watching the situation and hoping it does not come to that. So that's my discussion for the night. I just realized that a fan is running. Hopefully the sound of that isn't too bad on the video. If so, apologies. All these are kind of like recorded off the cuff. I don't really want to re-record the whole thing. If you enjoy my videos and my little discussions here of politics, history, foreign policy, philosophy, anything else that kind of comes up here, please do hop on there and subscribe and like the video and tell your friends. And once again, this is Office Hours with the Mad Professor. I'm Liam, and have a great night.